Welcome back to the Get a Q podcast. My name is Brandon Hall. I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Henry Turner. He is the principal of Newton North High School, recently named the Dive Awards Principal of the Year. You can find him on Twitter at TurnerHJ on Twitter and at Turner_HJ on Instagram. Dr. Turner, welcome to the Get a Q podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
So your work, to get into it, your work has focused mainly as a principal on anti-racism and equity, and looking at race and technology. And I do want to start with the presentation that you're going to be giving at the MassQ conference in February, entitled "Why Do We Need to Talk About Race in Tech?" So why do we need to talk about race in tech?
So I think that a lot of us have gone into this work around tech and ed tech, particularly with the idea of improving the lives of our students. And for a lot of years, we've used this idea that if we can level the playing field, we're going to improve lives. And I think we geek out on technology. I think sometimes we lose track of the outcomes when we kind of get excited for the tools. And this is very similar to the history. I'm a former history teacher. Yep. So this is very similar to the history of how technology has just played out, is that we see the technology being a good in itself as opposed to looking at the systemic problems we have. And I think that, and for someone who has been focused on addressing racism in education my entire career, is that I think that we're making a mistake when we're not acknowledging that the racism that exists in our schools and how technology can hurt it if we ignore it. And I've also heard when I've given presentations, people ahead of time on this topic, people say, why do we have to talk about race now? Why can't we just talk about technology? And it just reinforces this notion that we as people who are interested in technology are not seeing the importance of our role in looking at the faces of our students. And so I think that there are some clear ways that we can, as ed tech people, can take some steps to make sure that we are demonstrating anti-racism and helping to tear down the systemic racism in our schools so that we can make our schools better as opposed to hurting it.
Yeah. So big, broad topic, right? And with tons of issues surrounding it. What's the first step in attacking this problem?
So the first step is being aware of the problem, right? And so what I've heard from when I've given presentations on anti-racist leadership, I get a series of examples and steps that we can take. And leaders have said, well, what is, this just seems like good leadership. What's the difference? And the difference is that you need to acknowledge that racism exists. Mm-hmm. And you need to be aware that racism exists and recognize that each of us has a role in addressing racism. And I think for a lot of people, particularly white people, is that they feel really stuck. They may have a strong opinion that they think racism is bad, but they get stuck because they see racism as racist actions as that means that you're a bad person if you get labeled bad, as opposed to racism being a system of ideas and racist policies. So the first step is to acknowledge that we all have a role in racism and acknowledging that racism exists in our work.
So once that happens, is that something that you see happening at an individual school level or a global level or a townwide level? How do you see that play out?
All of it. It's got to be on the individual level, and it has to be led by our leaders. So, for example, we have a group of teachers who were inspired by the after the murders that happened this spring, particularly George Floyd, and they said we want a group that's going to solve, fight racism in our school. And so they've been meeting since the spring and coming up with all these solutions and all of these ideas, right, that they want to improve in kids' lives. And the thing that they haven't done, that's been the hardest part, is to acknowledge that they actually may be contributors to this. Mm-hmm. And because it's very easy to see, like, here are the problems that we see, but not realize that they individually have a problem, are a part of the problem. And, I would say, as one of the books that I think one of the great books written recently, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, is really about his unpacking of his own contributions to racism. And so it really has to be at the individual level. And it also has to be something that districts are leading to push people to give teachers time to really unpack it. But it really has to start with this commitment that I'm going to internally look at myself and see what my responsibility is. Lainey Rowell and I are working on an article right now on that it starts with commitment. And it really starts with, like, reflecting on your environment. Who are the people you're interacting with? When you're talking about race, how are you internally feeling? Like, it starts with some of these initial steps to just be aware, but you've got to first recognize that you're a part of the problem, and then you can start really diving into your own work.
Yeah. So as an individual, it's recognizing and identifying, and then you take a look at your curriculum, I would imagine, and think about where in the curriculum does it exist. Am I jumping too far ahead here?
No, you're doing great. So as an educator, I think there's a lot of different spokes that racism plays. So there's sort of our own internal personal work and commitment to racism outside of school, just in general, fighting racism. And then there's our work with our curriculum. How are we going beyond just representation? So as a teacher who is talking about, say I'm an English teacher, I may include Their Eyes Were Watching God in my curriculum, but that doesn't necessarily make me an anti-racist teacher because I have one book. I've got to pull out the lens that I want to have representation in a diversity of protagonists, and that we're fundamentally talking about race in my class. Right. And so I'm looking at all of my curriculum. If I'm talking about policies and practices, how am I looking at my grading practices? Who are the students who are underperforming in my school, and whose fault is that? At our school right now, we have identified that Black and Latinx students are achieving far less A's and B's than our white and Asian students. And a mindset that many of us have is that our students earn the grades. We don't give it, but yet we are the ones that create the participation grade and what's the percentage of that, and homework grades. We have a lot of ownership. So that's another example of policies and practices. So I think it's really starting to look at all of our different categories. Others would be discipline. Others would be, how do we interact with families? I think in a high-powered school like Newton North, a lot of us as educators sort of create these barriers because parents are so invasive, and yet the structures we create that push parents away push our most vulnerable parents away as well. So how are we engaging with parents would be another one.
Interesting. Yeah. So what steps does an individual take to then become more anti-racist as an educator or as an individual?
Yeah. So it's going through this cycle. The first cycle is acceptance and learning. And then it is about taking action. And then it's about reflecting on those actions and then assessing it, and continuously coming back to it. As someone who has been an educator that went into education to address systemic racism as a person of color who grew up in a majority white community, this was something that was my initial passion. Now in year 20 of myself as an educator, I'm still constantly going through this cycle of assessing my own work, learning more, reflecting on it, and assessing how do I get better. It is certainly the same model that we use in technology, that we acknowledge, that we push about taking risks and then assessing our risks, feeling comfortable failing. Like that's the same cycle, but yet we've got to focus that it's about race. It's not just about technology. It's not just about our teaching. It's about how are we how am I incorporating race into this conversation of this work?
Yeah. So how do you go back and reflect then on that and assess where you started and where you are now and where you'd like to be?
Yeah.
Like how, so yourself and then how would you say that to, like, say, a staff member or someone who's going through this process?
So I'll give you an example of we identified this summer going into this, knowing this year was going to be a crazy year, that we needed to look at grading. And so we looked at the data point on our of our disparities for Black and Latinx students that we were seeing, and worried that if we didn't do something, we were going to see an increase of students, particularly students of color, getting lower grades in our school. And so we presented this data to our teachers. So that's the learning, right? Here's the data that less than 50% of our, on a typical year, less than 50% of our A's and B's are students, are African American students, whereas 96% of Asian students, 90% of white students are achieving A's and B's. So that's the learning. So then the action are we are moving towards more standards-based grading. So we changed our grades from, we got rid of pluses and minuses, A, B, P, and G. We then said to teachers, so that's the action. That's the thing that we're trying out, right, for this year. And the pandemic is a great year to try something out. Next is we looked at research. So that's also part of the learning. Performance, progress, and process as sort of a structure for teachers individually to assess students. What are the students, what do you want them to learn? How are they progressing over the quarter? And what are some of the skills that they are developing over the course of time? How are we assessing them on that? We then gave teachers time to brainstorm ideas and also reflect on some of those ideas. And so they've been trying them out this quarter. The assessment is the quarterly grades, and then feedback from students on how it went. And so our teachers are currently doing that now. So we saw that we had about, with this process, a little over 90% of our students getting A's and B's. The group that improved the most were Black students in terms of achieving A's and B's this quarter. And so it's getting feedback from students. It's learning from it and then taking further steps. And so that's where it kind of goes back to the cycle. We're building on the cycle. So if I'm an individual teacher, I'm saying this from a principal's perspective.
Sure.
If I'm an individual teacher, I'm again trying out whether it's a teaching strategy or it's a grading practice, and constantly getting the feedback and reflection to see if it's working. And again, using race as the primary mindset to understand whether it's working or not.
Mm-hmm. And while we're sort of on the topic here of grades, we had talked in our pre-interview about some of the things that you're doing with your transcripts, and that you've got a social justice and a civic action seal on your transcripts. I'd love to hear about that, especially with Massachusetts' new standard adding the civic participation as part of a graduation requirement.
Sure. So we saw we've been doing some work over the last couple of years looking at how we're assessing our students and how we're demonstrating their learning. And so our transcript was one of the primary areas in our school council where we've been looking at this. And as we were doing some deep dives with our students, student story really hit us hard, which was the student said, I'm a senior, I just applied to colleges, and I spend 10 hours a week building sets for our theater department. And there was only one little box on the Common App where I could talk about this experience where I learned all these skills, developed all these skills, made all these real world skills. And there's only one little box that I was able to do that. And so we started talking about what are ways in which we can help students to demonstrate the skills that they're learning, where our classes are helping, but they're learning outside of the classroom as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so over the last couple of years, we've been kind of brainstorming this idea. There is this organization, mastery.org, that's kind of looking at reinventing the high school transcript. We've looked at some of the work they're doing. And we saw that, again, similar to the grading idea, we saw the pandemic as an opportunity for us to innovate. And so we rushed this a little bit faster than we thought and said, if some of our students have some time on their hands this year, let's give them an opportunity to do, whether it's civic action or whether it's social justice, knowing that that's where a lot of our students are putting a lot of their energy over the past year. So we fast forwarded these two seals. One is the seal of civic action, which honors students who are doing community service or or whether they're helping with a campaign or taking on a policy issue, whether in school or outside of school that they really care about. And the second one is social justice. This is whether they're leading a rally, like we had a bunch of Black Lives Matter protests in the spring, or they're doing something internally in school, or something they learned from a class where they've been able to process beyond just the work. And so ultimately, the idea of these two seals is that if students do a little bit of reflection of how they learned, what they learned from it, what are the skills that they learned from it, created a rubric, and in the same manner as the seal of biliteracy, which a lot of schools are doing, we are offering students a seal of civic action or social justice that honors the work that they've done over their 4 years.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I love this idea of being able to have that as part of the transcript. And my wife is a college counselor, and we spend a lot of time talking about that stuff at home. And I try and bring some of that information in for my own students here. And we took our kids to a Black Lives Matter protest in Easton in the late spring, early summer, that was completely organized by Olive Reim's high school seniors. And it's just remarkable. I think about, all of the kids that I've worked with in 19 years in education, to think about, we've had students that would do something like that. And it's not that they're looking for credit for it, but that it should be recognized. It should be acknowledged that, they put together this unbelievable program for change in the town. And it's not like, they had a bake sale.
Think about all the skills these kids are learning, right?
Yeah.
So a couple of years ago, we had students lead the anti-gun walkout, right?
Yep.
We had 1,500 kids on Tiger Drive, which is our main thoroughfare. That takes a lot of organization, communication with different parties. How do you put on a good performance? It is, how do you get the message right? Those are so many skills that students are developing, and we're not honoring that learning right now in our current model. What they see on the transcript is colleges see the grades, and they see this quantitative metric that, again, is all created by these false algorithms that we're creating, instead of sort of honoring the learning that students are doing. I think that's where the transcript needs to move to one where it's really a demonstration of what are kids learning in high schools, because we are doing amazing things in our schools.
Right.
And again, going back to anti-racism, this honors our students of color who are doing amazing things in our schools, and it gives them more offering of what to honor what they're doing.
Yeah, that extra avenue to be able to show what you know. Is just incredible. So in looking at the K12 Dive Award for Principal of the Year that just recently came out as an honor for you and your school, there were three things that they mentioned in the article. The first was anti-racism, which I think we've covered a bit here. The second was equity amid COVID-19, and the difficulties of that. What sort of actions have Newton North taken, and you as a principal and your staff and faculty and your students taken sort of to create equity in this time of uncertainty?
Sure. So I think it started with what we did on day one, which was March 13th, is we took care of our kids. We needed to make sure, where are our kids? Who are the kids that have that we can connect with? Who are the kids we can't, and how do we make sure we're connecting? with them? How is our staff? And I think throughout this this now 9 months, we've been using the mindset of put on your face mask first, your oxygen mask first, and we need to make sure that our kids are doing okay. So that started, and then we looked, knowing that we were moving into crisis distance learning, and then the next phase, which was distance learning that a lot of schools went to. I think we, a couple steps that we took that was smart was making sure that we weren't moving too fast until all of our kids were able to be connected. Making sure we were taking our time, so we made sure that our teaching online was in line with our values, which is that we're engaging kids, that's about relationships, and that we want kids thinking. And we faced a lot of pressure from families that we were moving too slowly. Kids were losing a lot of time. And what we saw was by being deliberate, taking our time, we eventually saw kids engaging more and more and more, particularly our students of color, our low-income students, our ELL students, and then rethinking about what are some of the policies that we want to take on and change that are in line with our values, but are kind of old stalwarts that we couldn't change in normal times. So we changed final exams at the end of the year, first of last year. And we went to more synthesis projects. And we had like 98% of kids participate in the synthesis projects. And I think it was because we were deliberate, we took our time, we focused on what we were student-centered, and we made sure that it was focused on relationships. And then over the summer, we started making policy decisions that we thought were in the best interest of all students. And the grading was one piece of it, but we also said that you can't get lower if you don't turn something in. There are no zeros. 50% is the lowest you can get for not turning something in, knowing that a zero has such a significant impact on a student when they don't turn something in, knowing we're in a crisis. Again, this is something I think we're going to be good at when we get out of this pandemic, but it's something we could address immediately. And we spent the first month of this year focusing on relationships. Our PD, we took, of the 10 days that we had for PD in the beginning of the year, 8 of them were on technology, anti-racism, and fostering relationships with kids. Mm-hmm. So 2 of them are about the interpersonal connections. And whether it was an AP class, whatever it was, we said the first month had to be focused on relationships. And we gave teachers time to come up with their 2-week plan, how to use an UDL structure around relationship building. And now that we're past the first quarter, what we found with that is that it's challenging. And because we have these relationships, we still have a high degree of students who are engaged. And I think that our grading structure also gave students the motivation to realize that they're not going to suffer because they are living in a crisis. And so I think that we got some buy-in from our kids because of that.
And then the third piece here in the article that I found really interesting was it said, acknowledge outrage with compassion. How do you, as a principal, balance that, right? Like understand the outrage, understand, whether it's about COVID-19 or, the current situation in the United States based on race or politics or what have you. How do you kind of keep the building, acknowledge that outrage, use compassion, keep the building sort of on track and not let the train get off the tracks, so to speak? How do you do that?
Yeah, well, that idea came from we've been victims of racist incidents the last couple of years, particularly in February last year. We had a couple of incidents where students were posting racist comments on social media. They were singing songs, making using racist words in the songs and posting on social media, and students were really upset by it. And what we learned through that process was that we did a lot of the right things. We investigated it, we addressed it with students, and teachers engaged with their classes to talk about them, and it really made it a community event. But what we learned was that our students didn't think we were upset by them. They thought that meaning the adults, so that the teachers who just knew that this racist incident had happened in our school, and they go right to calculus, to our students that said, well, this teacher doesn't really care. And when our deans are investigating it and they're asking questions to the victim or talking to the victim, and they're not showing them that they're upset when they may really be, but they're just trying to be professional. Right. They're saying to the student is, this is just another typical situation. And so what it signaled to us, and we talked to our Black Leadership Advisory Council, which is our group of students, African-American students, and they said, we don't think you care. You're doing the right things, but we don't think you care. And it just, it resonated with us that, we are angry that this is happening in our school, and our kids need to know that we are angry. We need to tell them we are angry. And so the idea of demonstrating your anger with compassion is that we do need to let folks know when we are upset by things happening to our community, and show our emotions.
Yeah. And
yet we also need to know that we're working with teenagers and that they're going to make mistakes. And so we need to, it's like when I screwed up a lot when I grew up, and, my parents were angry at me a lot growing up, and yet they still loved me, and I knew they loved me. Right. And so I think we need to show our students that, yes, we care about you, but we're angry when you do these things, but we're going to help you, and we're not going to let go of you about it. And I think that, as a principal, the hard part is that this takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
Right. How do you have a restorative circle with students? How do you have conversations with families when they're only, your point about COVID, they're only worried about their own family and their kid going to college, and they're not worried about the kids who don't have technology? Like, we need to have these individual conversations with them, because that is the work. And I think that it certainly is hard from because we have a lot of other things to do, but this really foundationally is the work. And I think that when people know that this is our value, it's clear, and other things can fall by the wayside.
Yeah. Just kind of wrapping things up, where can people find you online and some of the work that you're doing online? What kind of outside of all of this, which is unbelievably huge and impactful, what other things are you working on? Or I know you talked a little bit earlier about you're working on an article with someone.
Yeah. So, people can find me, got a website, henryjturner.com. They can find me on Twitter, TurnerHJ, and on Instagram, Turner_HJ. I've got a couple things working. I'm working on an article, as I said, with Lainey Rowell around, she is an educator in California. And we're talking about how do we commit to anti-racism, and her as a white person, he's a person of color. We're kind of working through that idea. Also doing a lot of work within my school district, but helping other school districts kind of get this work moving and going, and also kind of thinking about what is it, for some longer term projects, what does it mean to be an organization that is anti-racist? And how do we kind of do it on a systemic level, where you have a lot of different players and people.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate having you here. Best of luck for the rest of the school year. Stay healthy and happy holidays. Dr. Henry Turner, Newton North High School. Congratulations again on Principal of the Year from K12 Dive Awards. And we hope to see you at the virtual conference too.
You'll see me there. Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Be sure to rate and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, and anywhere podcasts can be found. This is the Get a Q podcast from MassQ, here to educate, connect, and inspire.